welcome back to the Your Most Interesting Story podcast. I'm Rob, and each episode my co-host Jake and I hear about and dig into the most interesting thing that's happened to someone in their life. These are first-hand, true stories told by the people who experienced them. With a grandfather who is in the fireworks industry, this episode's guest believes he may have bombs in his blood. Let's hear Eric's most interesting story.
I do think a lot about how my life was probably going to go in one track and how that was all taken away, if you will, and shut down before I would have ever had a chance to do it because of my mother's ultimatum. Back then, the fireworks business was dangerous. Fireworks are just bombs. And so just the nature of that and those things being relatively sizable, you can imagine what would happen to the human body if you happen to be close to one and it exploded. She didn't want him killed or injured. She also didn't want the business to move forward with him and then eventually me or whoever in the family taking it over. I had known since my earliest memories that we were in the fireworks business. It was this sort of big thing that also was kept away from the kids because of the danger involved. My grandfather did shows all over the Eastern Seaboard. He would do the 4th of July fireworks or a major celebration for like a city's 100th anniversary, whatever the case might be. He came over, I think in 1900, I want to say, or possibly in 1912 from Italy. For some reason or other, the fireworks business was a big Italian thing. So most fireworks families, and a lot of it was family business, were Italian families.
Fireworks originated in ancient China. Eventually, the art of firework making traveled along trade routes to Europe, where it was developed even further, particularly in Italy. When European settlers arrived in the Americas, they brought fireworks with them, with Italian immigrants playing a pivotal role in shaping the fireworks industry as we know it today.
So he and his brother opened a factory to help provide bombs to the military for World War II. That experience and expertise is what eventually led them to start doing this fireworks. I remember learning that for a while there, he was in the restaurant business, but I don't get the sense that that was anything more than a little bit of an excursion from getting into fireworks. It was that all the way through to 1976 when he passed away. My grandfather was very specific about giving a very integrated kind of show. He wanted both ground sets as well as bombs in the air.
So is the ground set a stationary ground-level fireworks display that would coordinate with what's going on in the air?
Exactly. And sometimes they would flip back and forth. It'd be like the aerial displays, and they would do this ground display. And of course, the finale is when everything was just light it all up and everything just went crazy. One of the earliest memories I've had was of my father actually building the ground displays in our garage. Once that was done, they would attach flares or whatever it is that they wanted to attach to trace the picture in the frame. And then at various parts of the show, they would light that up with a fuse. The whole thing would burn and you would see this blazing green, let's say tank, for example. In the case of my hometown, there's a river that goes through the town called the Genesee River. For anybody who might not be familiar, that's where Genesee beer comes from, which is a big brand in Rochester, New York, in the Northeast.
When I was a kid, we would visit relatives in Buffalo, New York, and I remember my uncles drinking Genesee cream ale.
That's where the name comes from. So he would be on one bank of the river, and the public would just sort of gather around the banks of the river, on the various bridges. A lot of people would watch from their apartment buildings, office buildings. The interesting thing about that is you had the effect of the reflection in the river, which kind of added to the impressiveness of the display. But then you also had the echoing off the buildings, which you don't get if you're out in a wide open field. You can hear an echo, but it's not the same as hearing the reports come back off the buildings. It's a real interesting effect. The other memory I have is a little bit lighter. Part of what my grandfather would do is make these little sparklers, and we would get just tons of these things at home, and our family of kids, and then we'd give them to the kids in the neighborhood. We'd all run around with these sparklers, and my cousin who lived down the street and I decided to attach these sparklers to the Estes Model Rockets and light them off and see what they would look like at night.
Estes Rockets, in business since 1958, is the largest and oldest model rocket manufacturer. Estes has maintained a dominant market share throughout its history, despite more specialized competitors appearing on the scene in the late 1900s.
They went up only a couple of 100 feet, and if my grandfather knew about that, he probably would be mad at us, but it was fun stuff.
So he wasn't recruiting the kids in the neighborhood by giving them sparklers?
No, because you kind of figure that would, right? One of the reasons why it was so dangerous is these were all lit by hand. You would light a fuse. Very similar to what you might see in like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. I remember a few shows being close enough where they allowed me to watch it when I got a little bit older. You got a torch in your hand, a flare, and you're running and you've got a certain order and a certain amount of time to hit and light each of these fuses to get the show timing perfectly and get the shells to be in the sky where you wanted them to be. They were pointed in different directions. Different shells were bigger, smaller. They had different patterns. Some went higher, some went lower. Some were just for sound. Some were only for visual, and everything in between. So these things were pointed all over the place. And these guys would run, literally run between where all of these different launch tubes were set up. This is not just they hear, just light the fuse and walk away. They're running, lighting something all the time. And it's a relatively big area where all these tubes are.
So who would be the one running around and lighting all these fuses? That seems like a pretty dangerous yet important role and responsibility.
I know there's a few of them. My father did many times. My grandfather certainly did. Not everybody could earn the torch. The bigger danger was in the factory, which was only a few miles away from where we lived. They had several factory explosions, one of which killed one of the partners. And then in 1970, so I would have been 5 years old, there was an explosion in which my granduncle, his brother, was killed.
Oh, wow.
And I remember asking my father about this one. The reason I asked him this question is because he stopped going to fireworks shows after a time. Just didn't have any appeal to him. He'd sort of been in the business from the inside. So we were here, it was the 4th of July, and I was asking him why he wasn't going. And he just said, because of what I just explained. And also it had some bad memories. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So what memories? He was working with my grandfather when the factory exploded and he lost his uncle. The factory was basically just blown to smithereens. He had to go to the hospital to identify the remains. And the way that he described it was, you could not tell that this was a human being.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Then he broke down. And I was like, okay, I'm done asking about that. A little bit prior to this in time, my mother basically said, it's either fireworks or us, it's not both. She just was dead set against it. As I remember them telling me, and again, this was all when I was single-digit age, maybe 10. My father was helping my grandfather to put on a show, and one of the shell's fuse jumped.
Fuse jumping refers to the unintended transfer of fire from one fuse to another nearby fuse. This can happen due to the close proximity of the fireworks, the type of fuses used, or improper handling and setup. When fuse jumping occurs, it can lead to premature ignition, which is understandably dangerous and can cause unpredictable results.
And it blew up on the ground or very shortly off the ground, and it burned half his face. Now, the good news was that he was able to get away in time, that the burns were not super severe. They weren't trivial either. So I know he was in the hospital. Fortunately, everything healed up just fine, but a slight difference in timing or distance, and he could have either been killed or lost an eye or whatever. And so at that point, my mother was adamant that that's it, you're done. And then he went into the advertising business and eventually industrial development. Still helped my grandfather. He did do a couple of shows where my grandfather needed a hand, and I know my mother was not very happy about that, but they were one-offs and everything went fine, so there were no issues.
Did your grandfather and your mother interact much?
There's an interesting family history there that I don't want to get into. But they did eventually. I don't think that there was any hard feeling or bad blood about her preventing my father or the next generation down. My grandfather, he would get real testy if the kids were too close to stuff because he just didn't want to risk anything. I don't get that sense that there was any hard feelings about that. There could have been. But if you know my mother, her feelings would have been very clearly and well made. Italian families, you never are able to hide your emotions or feelings. It just does not happen. I learned about how fireworks are made, how at the time shows were produced, and it's very simple and complex at the same time. I always thought, how do they put a shell up into the sky and have it explode so that it produces something like, as an example, a smiley face?
Here's how shapes are made in the sky with fireworks. The initial fuse is lit, which ignites the lift charge, which is typically gunpowder packed into the base of the firework shell. This propels the shell into the air, but it also ignites the delay or time fuse, which continues to burn as the shell travels up into the sky. When the shell reaches its peak, the delay fuse ignites the burst charge, scattering out lit pellets, which are also called stars, in the exact shape they were previously arranged in within the shell.
And how do they have shells that will not only produce an image, but will change color? And it's all chemistry.
Yes, it is. The colors in fireworks patterns and shapes are created by adding different chemical compounds to the previously mentioned stars. Different compounds produce different colors when they burn. For example, strontium salts produce red, copper salts produce blue, and sodium compounds produce yellow.
These days, they've got all of this stuff computerized in software. They go out and they fill all of these tubes with the shells, and everything is automated. So you've got electronic wires that light every single shell. If they have a ground display, same thing. And they're way back half a mile away or whatever the case might be in a truck or wherever they have their setup. In a certain sense, it's kind of similar to what you would see for a lighting person, maybe at like a rock concert. You've got patterns pre-programmed. You're not manipulating every light. And you push buttons for different periods or phases of the show, and you monitor everything. But it's all automated, right? So if something goes wrong, and it does still happen, where a bomb might go off on the ground or something like that, yeah, okay, you lose an effect, but nobody's going to get hurt. The only time you'll read a headline about somebody being injured with a firework is when somebody individual is doing something stupid on their own. Very different back, 30, 40, 50 years ago. These guys, I remember, would yell and swear, and it's just part of the reason why my mother probably didn't want me involved.
Were they drinking Genesee beer at the same time?
Or
did they wait until afterwards?
Yeah, I would hope till afterward.
When you were talking about the different kinds of images in the sky, what kind of complexity level are we talking about? Because if I'm trying to remember fireworks shows that I've seen, I feel like what you could do is like shoot 3 circles in the sky to make a Mickey Mouse head, maybe do a smiley face. But what kind of images are you able to create here with these fireworks?
Again, back during the time period I'm talking about, it's not too far off what you said. I think the most complex one that I've seen in recent years, I think I saw a heart once in the sky. I'm just like, okay, everybody I'm with is watching this fireworks show and they're dazzled. And every time I'm at a fireworks show these days, all right, so this would mean that they would needed to do this shell with this kind of stuff inside it. And it kind of takes some of the joy away. But No, I think you hit it, Jake. We're not talking super complex pieces of art like mimicking the Mona Lisa, nothing like that. I mean, I think they can do some more interesting things than they used to be able to do. But I do think it's sort of still in that foundational shapes kind of range of possibilities versus anything more artistic.
Considering your grandfather is an old school Italian guy from the old country, living in New York, making what is essentially bombs, was he ever approached by the mafia to use fireworks for some nefarious deeds?
I honestly do not know. I've never heard of that happening, but if it had happened, nobody would have told me. Who knows?
Okay, so you say if it would have happened, you would not have heard anything, and you didn't hear anything. So I think we could safely assume that it happened.
Right, right.
I don't know. I think the business of fireworks is tough enough on its own, but hey, I mean, who knows?
That's what I'm saying. He could have got approached like, hey, we'll give you like double the going rate. And you just can't tell anyone that we bought them from you.
Well, I can tell you, he was never arrested or charged with anything like that. So hopefully that means no.
Do you think your dad ever regretted not being in the business?
No, I don't think so. My dad's a very artistic guy, or was, I should say. He loved the art of it. I think he loved the science of it, but the danger of it, he had seen up close more than just that time that I told you about. My father was a very gentle, peaceful man. And I think the memory of that over seeing it, several times over many years, I could tell it really deeply disturbed him when I finally spoke with him about it, deeper than I think I was even aware. I think that really left an impression on him. To repeat myself here a bit, I think he loved the artistic part of it, the creative part of it, because there was that. And he was able to bring that to bear later years when he built these ground sets, which was a non-dangerous kind of thing. So I don't think he regretted it.
Did your grandfather's business have a slogan? With your dad in the advertising business, I could see him coming up with something snappy.
One of the things we always had every year was this big allotment of these giant yellow pens. The promotional pen for my grandfather's business was Doritos Fireworks. And there was some slogan on there, and I don't remember what it was. I don't think it was anything like, oh my God, that's brilliant. I just think it was like pyrotechnicians, et cetera, et cetera. Those pens were fantastic because I'd bring them to school and use them all the time. They're like, where'd you get this? And I get teased about it and all that stuff. And
did you ever try to impress anybody by telling them that your family was in the fireworks business?
Yes, all the time. I did. I felt very proud of it and a little bit braggadocious about it. And I think I was more impressed than most of the friends I tried to impress. I think people thought it was cool, but that was it.
You mentioned the term fuse jumping. Any other cool vernacular or other words that the insiders in the industry might have used?
No, I mean, it's less flamboyant than you might think. Aerial display, ground display. I can't think of what they all are, but there's different names for each type of shell. There's, Roman candles are a thing, right? And you see them today in fireworks shows.
Ooh, Roman candle. And then the whole Italian thing. Do you think there's any connection there?
That's a great question. I never thought about that. There probably is.
Your grandpa could have invented the Roman candle.
So blowing things up is probably fun for some people. Do you recall any interesting characters that would work for your grandfather? Maybe some of them a little more quirky than others?
No, they were all pretty grungy looking guys, as far as I recall. Not every single one, but a lot of them. The cast of characters who used to do that stuff, like actually put the shows on, they were probably not people that most parents would want their kids to be around. But, hey, whatever. I mean, people have to make a living, and that's what they did. But I'll tell you something about me.
Oh, good. Let's hear about quirky Eric.
Maybe it was the influence of the family. Maybe it was just kids being kids. I don't know. I got into making my own little smoke bombs after a while, and even like sort of bombs. And so I figure it's probably got to be in my blood in some way, right? But we did have a lot of fun trying to create this stuff, usually having it either not work or more often not work the way we were hoping. We were always hoping for the big boom. We got something that sort of approximated a little bit of a boom, but it was mostly like these amazing smoke bombs. And I did more and more of that kind of stuff till I think my mother caught me one day, and that was the end of that.
What historical figure, based on the skill set of pyrotechnician, do you think might have missed their calling and should have been in fireworks instead of what they did?
Whoa, gosh, yeah. I'll start by saying it probably would have been Italian, because that just seems to be part of the mix. And I'll say probably an Italian military leader would be my guess. Although we shouldn't rule out people like Da Vinci. Yeah. I mean, he's a great artist, but also a great inventor and all that. And he and others, I think I recall reading that they dabbled in a whole variety of different mediums, and there's no reason why gunpowder couldn't have been one of them.
He might have gone well past the heart shape you mentioned earlier.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's a tough business. The margins, as they say, were thin. It's a tough living. Being in the business at that time was very much like being a roadie on a big rock tour. It was a hard life, always building and tearing down. The work itself of actually putting on the show was physically demanding. I always saw it as a glamorous until I started to learn everything about it. But it was fun to sort of be maybe not part of that in the literal sense, but to be involved in it and sort of have it be part of the family blood.
And that's going to bring Eric's story to an end. Remember that you can visit YMIS Podcast on Instagram for pics related to this episode. Maybe you want to wrap your head around how those fireworks shells work. We'd also love to hear from you, and we've got a number of ways you can contact the show, including Instagram. You can also leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify. You can email us at ymispodcast@gmail.com. And you can now text the show. Just use the link in the episode description. It's a one-way text, so we can't respond, but we will see it, and we certainly appreciate all feedback. Your Most Interesting Story is available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube. If you'd like to support the show, we love 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. But you can also like, rate, review, share, and or subscribe on any podcast platform you prefer. Or you can buy us a coffee. If you want us to tell your most interesting story, follow the link to our website in our show description. Until next time, be interesting.
Burning stuff I always thought was great. It's just wafting down. Hot, maybe smoky a little bit. I would buy just books and books and books of matches. Paper matches or the wooden matches. Cut the heads off.
It's better than cutting the heads off of something else.